how is it that the role of the Arabs continues to decline in the wider Ummah? And these new converts from the periphery, these non-Arabs, Ajam as they're called, how do they integrate into the Muslim community? And what kind of pre-Islamic, non-Islamic, and new Islamic ideas do they use to not just legitimate their power, but to articulate an even stronger claim to power than even the Abbasid caliphs at the very heart of the Islamic world? So just to remind ourselves, the Abbasid Caliphate is already undergoing a great many changes. The Abbasid caliphs realized that in order to rebalance the court in their favor, they need to bring in a new element. And one caliph in particular, Caliph Al-Mu'tasim, makes use of Turkic slaves. Now, there were many Turkic slaves that were gifted from the principalities in the east as gifts. And there were also many slaves in the slave markets of Baghdad. They made for excellent warriors in the minds of the Abbasid elites. They formed a very rugged people who came from the steppe, who were accustomed to various hardships and could muster the energy and the wherewithal to enter into combat and to defeat the myriad enemies of the Abbasids, making them ideal recruits for a slave corps, beholden to no one else but the Abbasid caliph. Al-Mu'tasim has this idea that all of these new viziers, all of these new bureaucrats and Persian elites from noble landed aristocratic families that are flooding into the imperial center, these could be balanced against by the establishment of a slave corps under his command. A slave corps that will come from the outside of this kind of Muslim ummah, be converted into Islam and beholden to their master, the caliph, and no one else. This actually works quite well. This works quite well, and Al-Mu'tasim manages to re-centralize power to balance against these powerful viziers and vested interests at the capital and to bring all of them back under heel. However, that doesn't mean that he re-centralizes control over Khorasan, the Islamic East. That unruly land full of various nobles and landed aristocrats, that remains under more or less semi-autonomous control. Those big clans are ruled in partnership with the Tahirids. The Tahirids are a family of landed aristocratic nobility from the northeast, Khwarezm. They convert to Islam and acculturate into the Arabo-Islamic world, but they never really fully establish independence. This is a partnership with the Abbasid Caliph. They collect revenues from all across Khorasan, ruling with a light touch and sending that revenue to the imperial center. Nonetheless, Al-Mu'tasim manages to reconsolidate control over a great expanse of territory in the Middle East. All the green that you see here. Nonetheless, this is the beginning of the end. The introduction of the Turkic slave element is a ticking time bomb. Why is this so? This is largely because they themselves become another one of these entrenched elites. They form alliances with various viziers. They are given fiefdoms and land holdings. They become integrated into the society that they see around them. Unlike the initial generation, these are not people from the outside anymore. These are people that are well integrated into the fabric of society, and they want to procure and preserve their interests. When one of the caliphs decides to expropriate some of the estates and cancel some of the salaries of the leading Turkic emirs, these emirs think that we have the group solidarity as well as the alliances in the local land to check the power of the caliph, to ensure that can't just expropriate our estates. He can't just take away our salaries. Eventually, this leads to a period of anarchy, the so-called Anarchy of Samarra. In this period, you see various caliphs put on the throne, various Turkmen emirs vying with one another over who gets to put the next caliph on the throne. Each person has a successor in mind, their own candidate that will preserve their own particular interests and destroy that of their enemies. This infighting causes the internal kind of collapse of Abbasid authority, as various elites, predominantly the Turkic slave corps, vie over who gets to control the caliph, who gets to control, i.e. this figurehead. And the caliph increasingly becomes a figurehead rather than a fountain of authority in and of himself. This is the perfect opportunity for all of those autonomous and semi-autonomous emirs and military landed aristocrats in the east, in Khorasan, to break free. Given the anarchic kind of state of affairs at Baghdad, they think, if I don't send forth the annual tribute, if I then send forth all of the tax due to the caliph, who is going to come and collect it? It's absolute chaos. This is the perfect opportunity to withhold all of those revenues that I would send to Baghdad and to spend those revenues on augmenting my own strength so that I preserve my independence, so that I preserve my own autonomy and ensure that I pass it down to my lineage. These dynasties, emirates, start emerging that really have a tenuous link with Baghdad. It is mostly a nominal submission that they have for the caliph. In de facto terms, they are independent princes and dynasts in their own right. This leads to a mistake, usually, in the historiography, because traditionally the historiographic picture that is painted of this period is one that is heavily informed by nationalistic and pseudo-nationalistic ideas of an Iranian revival. That is not what we see. We don't see the re-establishment of a political unit called Iran with a king of Iran that is somehow an independent imperial entity in the way that the Sasanian Empire was, Iran Shah. Nonetheless, there are various models from the pre-Islamic Iranian past which inform the ways in which these emirs articulate their authority and identity. It is not just a matter of pure authority, of course, because it's happening within a burgeoning political culture of Persianate discourse. And they draw from notions of authority that tie their lineage to pre-Islamic Iranian heroes or kings, that express their authority and their imperial aura in terms of pre-Islamic Persianate imperial models and bureaucratic models, administrative forms of government, and more than a renaissance, actually. It is an era of creation. It is an era of birth. This is when you see the emergence of a new language, New Persian. And it's in the East, not in the Persian heartland in southern Iran, where New Persian emerges. New Persian is a lingua franca that emerges in the East, alongside the existing lingua franca of Arabic. That's another issue that I have with the historiographic model that is pseudo-nationalistic. You don't see an out-and-out attack on Arabic language, because there is no ethno-lingual kind of base for identity. All of these elites and many of these new emirates still retain Arabic as the lingua franca of theology and scientific discourse, as well as, of course, bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy by this time is heavily Arabized. So we shouldn't see it as two different, antithetical Arab and Persian kind of systems colliding. That is not what is going on. There's more of, well, an enriching, a acculturation of an old or imagined kind of pre-Islamic Persianate identity that finds itself side by side with an Arabo-Islamic identity. These emirs are not choosing between these two. They are embracing both of these. And that's what we should keep in mind. These are emirs who see themselves as part of a wider ummah. They are not seeing themselves as breaking free and apart from the Muslim community. They see themselves as integral members of that community. And they're emirates rather than independent empires. What does an emirate mean? An emirate comes from, of course, the title of
Emir.
Amir. What does Amir mean?
I don't know if there's any backward reference, like governor.
Close. Amir literally means, it comes from the root Arabic term amr, to command or order. Amir, he who commands, i.e. commander. This is not a very special or grandiose title. This is a fairly uncontroversial title. If you are an Amir, it doesn't necessarily hint at a kind of hereditary title. It is not necessarily going to imply that you are a dynast. So this is exactly the title that is granted by the caliphs to these raising rulers, generals, strongmen in the Islamic East. The Samanids are a very good example of this. They come from, of course, a landed, noble household, and very much like their Tahirid predecessors, they also come from a non-Arab or Ajam kind of household. Just a note on the etymology. We usually don't see terms like Iranian or Persian. What we see is the dichotomy of Arab and Ajam. Arab, you all know what that means. Ajam is, in the Arabic language, to mumble. It's very similar to Greek and barbarian. Those who cannot speak distinctly, i.e. excellent Arabic, they mumble, they are Ajam, and it denotes pretty much everyone who doesn't fall into this category. It's a kind of catch-all category. And it becomes heavily associated with the Persianate world. It becomes heavily associated with the old Sasanian world, stretching from the Euphrates to the Oxus and beyond. And these people are very consciously and proudly claiming an Ajam heritage, a non-Arab heritage. And they don't see it in any way as undermining their authority or their claim to power or their clout. In fact, they start articulating sometimes very legendary, mythical ancestries of their own. If the Abbasids are descendants of the Hashemite clan, the clan of the Prophet, these people are non-Bedouin Arabs. They can't really make the same or fabricate the same claims convincingly. So instead, they fabricate claims to Bahram Chubin, the old Parthian Sasanian general and hero that appears also in the legendary tradition of the Shahnameh. They fabricate genealogies which exalt and raise their lineage and justify the new power that they hold. Nonetheless, they don't ideologically break free of the Abbasids. They are still loyal to the Abbasids, and they pay lip service to being vassals of the Abbasids, to rule in their name. You can see this most clearly in the coins that they mint. The coins that they mint are very similar to the coins that were previously minted in the Abbasid Caliphate. There on the left, you have La ilaha illallah, Muhammadan Rasulullah, the creed, there is no God but the one God, and Muhammad is his messenger. And on the other hand, you have the name of the caliph, as well as the name of the emir that rules in the East. So by acknowledging the caliph, they are telling their constituents that we are still part of the same ummah. We are still loyal to the Khalifatullah or Khalifat Rasulullah. We are still pious Muslims. The Islamic creed is there, of course. And I am ruling as he who is designated and given command by the leader of the Muslims, Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the faithful, back in Baghdad. Therefore, I have a right to rule over you. I have a legitimate claim to power. This is, as you can see, they're not abandoning the Arabo-Islamic identity that is the dominant discourse. They are integrating into it a new Persianate discourse to really shore up their position. And it's in this period that you have the emergence of a literary corpus called classical Persian literature. These are mostly works of poetry, and the emergence of this new language is not completely uncontroversial. There are some Ajam, non-Arabs, like al-Biruni, one of the greatest intellectuals of this period, who is uncomfortable with the rise of non-Arabic language as a lingua franca and speaks against it. He wants Arabic to remain the dominant lingua franca of the elites, of intellectual, theological, and political discourse. Nonetheless, despite these objections, the overall picture is one of a burgeoning literary community. And especially among the elites, this lingua franca has a great deal of popularity. The courts are dominated by poets of the new language, and various forms of Persian poetry are patronized and celebrated at these courts. At the bottom here, you see many of the great masters of classical Persian poetry. On the left, you have Ferdowsi, you have Onsori, you have Farrukhi Sistani. All of these great literary minds find patronage across all of these emirates and these courts that are hungry for their literary talents and celebrate them and want to be associated with this new burgeoning cultural discourse in Persian. We're going to talk about two distinctly Persianate dynasties here. One is the Ghaznavids and the other the Karakhanids. The Ghaznavids correspond to the orange kind of blob that you see corresponding to the Islamic East, Khorasan, and above it, that dotted red sphere is the realm of the Karakhanids. You might be able to tell from the names, in origin, these are also Ajam in the sense that they are not Arab. They come from Turkic backgrounds. These are initially people who are vassals and emirs within the Samanid and Taharid army, and eventually they displace their overlords and take over the reins of power. The Ghaznavids are a very good example of this. They are established by a Mamluk general called Sabuktigin, and his son Mahmud establishes that large imperium that you see on the map. Nonetheless, when it comes to articulating a genealogy, to be born from a kind of slave core background is not that valuable and does not signal any kind of particular claim to power. So they fabricate, like their overlords, some kind of genealogical link between themselves and the pre-Islamic Persianate past. Whether it's a great king from the Sasanian dynasty or some champion from the pre-Islamic past, mythical past, it's within this Persianate literary discourse that they find themselves articulating a lineage that would give them the right and the justification to rule as de facto independent rulers. They are, in and of themselves, of course, great patrons of the literati. One of the main works that has great historical importance that comes about in this period, initially under the patronage of the Samanids, and later after the Samanids fall, the patronage of the Ghaznavids, you find Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. Shahnameh means in Persian, Book of Kings. It's a monumental work of literary Persian verse. It's 50,000 or in excess of 50,000 verses. It is remarkably long, and it sifts together myths, legends, and history of pre-Islamic Iran. Of course, when it came about, because of how innovative the style and the format was, it didn't gain all that much traction. But with time, it will become the leading example of a wider classical epic Persian corpus that deals with the heroes of pre-Islamic Persia, mythical and historical. And just look at how beautiful this painting is. It's the great pale demon taking into his cave as prisoners and blinding the Persian king and his two sons. Beyond that, don't expect me to say much about it. I know nothing of art history. So we will move on. What are the themes of the Shahnameh? Of course, it's based on pre-Islamic Persian liturgy. Part of it is drawn from Avestan kind of stories, and the Avesta is the sacred text of Zoroastrianism. And part of it is to do with the old Parthian and Sasanian military landed aristocracy and their legends in eastern Iran. It's, of course, because it's a Zoroastrian text in origin, it is going to be about the struggle between light and dark. It is the struggle between men and demons. And of course, between Iranians and Turanians. These are the two main protagonists, or rather, the Iranians are the protagonists and the Turanians are the antagonists of the Shahnameh. These are the two imperial realms that are fighting one another. And Iran is, of course, corresponded with the old Sasanian Empire, stretching from the Euphrates to the Oxus. Here, really, it's the Ghaznavids who claim to be the successors and inheritors of Iran realm. And they think of the Karakhanids who ruled to the north of the Oxus, because the Turanians and the Shahnameh are also an imperial people to the north of the Oxus, as the successors, Karakhanids as the successors of the historical mythical enemy of the Turanians. These Persianate models of seeing the world and making sense of political realities as well as literary kind of topoi, this is something that is not just prevalent amongst the Ghaznavids, but also the Karakhanids themselves. The Karakhanids, because they are also a Persianate empire, they incorporate this notion of belonging to Turan. And despite the Turanians being the enemies in the Shahnameh, they are a grand people with a grand history of imperial rulership, and the Karakhanids adopt this model and identify themselves, yes, we are the Turanians. We are the sons of the great Turanian king Afrasiab. So you have people on either side of the Oxus partaking in this Perso-Islamic, and yes, the Shahnameh is an Islamicized version of these old pre-Islamic Zoroastrian tales, and acculturating into Islam through a Persianate lens. So what is the world? We already kind of hinted at Iran and Turan. What is the world of the Shahnameh? And the Shahnameh builds a world which is divided into three imperial spheres: Rome, Iran, and Turan. And these are really personified in the three brothers. There is one imperial ruler of the world called Afridun, and Afridun, here you can see him, he's turned into a dragon, and he's really administering a test to his three sons. He's seeing what they're made of. He's testing their mettle. And he wants to do this in order to wisely and judiciously divide his world empire amongst the three brothers. Now, you can see that the person running away on top, that is Salm, the personification of Rome. And the Romans are regarded, like Sam, their progenitor, as a wise and sagacious people, yet ultimately cowardly. He sees the dragon and says, I'm not going to fight a dragon, it'll kill me. He runs away. On the other hand, the person brandishing a sword is Turan, Tur. The Turanians are thought of as quite the opposite of the Romans. They have no brains, but they have a great deal of courage, without even thinking twice. As soon as he sees the dragon, he draws his bow, he draws his sword, and he wants to charge in. And of course, you can tell what side kind of is envisioning this kind of world history and this kind of narrative. You have Iraj. You have the personification of Iran, who calmly and courageously approaches the dragon and engages him in discourse and diffuses the entire situation by just how brilliantly smart and diplomatic he is. This is the ultimate version of self-flattery. We are just perfect. We have both courage as well as brains. Whereas the Romans, they lack courage, they might be smart, and the Turanians, they're dumb, even though they might be courageous. And it's this kind of world in which these Persianate elites start to situate themselves in and argue for belonging to this tradition of the Shahnameh or that tradition, to exemplify this character or that figure of the Shahnameh. Of course, a lot of these emirs are remarkably ambitious people. Just because they give nominal homage to the Abbasid Caliph does not in any way mean that they're not rooting for imperial and universal sovereignty. And for them, the quintessential example of universal sovereignty in the Shahnameh is Jamshid. Why Jamshid? Jamshid in the Shahnameh rules over Iran and non-Iran. He rules over man and beast. He rules over man and woman, near and far, land and sea. The entire world is his dominion. And so whenever one of these Persianate emirs wants to really push a title to universal dominion, he is describing himself usually as Jamshid. And his court poets are, of course, drawing parallels between him and Jamshid. He is supposed to also embody, remember we talked about the unity of faith and state? Well, Jamshid in the Shahnameh is described as being the wielder of both Shahriyari va Mobadi, both kingship and priesthood. It is one and the same discourse. To have sacral authority and imperial authority, these are synonymous. You don't even need to say them separately. They are inextricably linked. And you find a very beautiful and resonant expression of this that these emirs can reach for as the ideological model of their authority. And the idea of Far, of course, this divinely bestowed glory, this quintessentially pre-Islamic Zoroastrian luminous force that emanates from the God of light and marks out the rightful champion or the rightful divinely ordained universal ruler, this is something that they're very much enamored with. Constantly in the court poetry and panegyrics, these court poets are flattering the emir by saying he is the one who wields Far. He is the one who God has bestowed Far upon. But other than Jamshid, there is one character that is very alluring for these emirs. They want to draw parallels with Rostam, Rostam Dastan, Rostam the beguiler, or Rustam the trickster. Sometimes he's, for Western audiences, likened to the Hercules of the Shahnameh. To some extent, he's a strong champion that has many labors and many adventures. So in that sense, it's not a bad comparison. But the comparison breaks down when you look at really the nature of the personality. Hercules is remarkably dim-witted. And a lot of the stories are him just demonstrating that he's all brawn, no brain. But Rustam is kind of the opposite. Rustam is definitely just as brutishly arrogant as Hercules. However, what he realizes is when he's combating against mere mortals, he has no trouble because he has demon blood in him. And he easily vanquishes his mortal enemies. The problem is when he gets arrogant enough to challenge a real champion or a real demon or a dragon, a true foe, that he quickly understands, I'm going to get killed in this battle unless I use some trick or another. He is a quintessential trickster, beguiler, and that's his character. In his most astonishing victories, it's really through a sleight of hand, a trick, some kind of stratagem that he manages to prevail. He does not prevail through muscle and military power alone. And this, I think, appeals very much to these very sly, very cunning and strategic emirs who realize and see a reflection of themselves in Rustam. This strong man, but who also has to be very strategic about his decisions, who has to rely on the art of war and stratagem in order to overcome his enemies. You can't always approach every problem or enemy in a straightforward manner. It requires a little bit of trickery. It requires lying. It requires deceit. And that's why they see Rustam, who also is somewhat of a morally ambiguous character. Remember, on his mother's side, he is descended from a demon. That's not good news. And also, just as much as he uses the military art, the masculine art, honar, he also makes use of jadoo, the effeminate, dark sorcery in the Shahnameh. And he combines these two in a very morally ambiguous way in order to drive forward the overall good of Iran. In this painting, you see the mother of Rustam, Rudabe, trying to give birth. But Rustam was so big, apparently, that he was about to both kill himself and his mother. So his father here has burnt a feather from a phoenix in order to summon the phoenix, and the phoenix will essentially perform a cesarean on the mother, saving both the life of the mother and of Rustam. It kind of gives you the sense of this is a literally larger-than-life character. And of course, the Ghaznavid poets are very much attuned to these literary themes and legendary figures, and constantly draw parallels with their imperial patron and the Shahnameh figures. So, you are the sovereign of the world. You are the pride of the children of Adam. You are wiser than Rustam in the art of war and guile. And then he goes on, Farrokhi Sistani, to say, how can the Turanians reconcile with the Iranians after all the triumphs which Iran has enjoyed over Turan? Again, not just talking about the legendary kind of triumphs that you hear about in the Shahnameh, but talking about and alluding to all of the Ghaznavid victories against the Karakhanid enemy. He's lauding the military prowess of the dynasty that he's patronizing. If you venture into the realm even now, you shall find fountains of blood streaming like tears unleashed by Rustam's blade. So he's drawing a parallel and he's creating this kind of ancestry of conquest. We Ghaznavids have ventured into their realm as our ancestor Rustam had, and we have vanquished them all. This kind of militaristic way of connecting the Ghaznavid patrons to the Persianate past is something that is quite common. When we say Persianate, we do not necessarily always mean it is in Persian. The poetry and the allusions could be made in Arabic, and very frequently they were. In the southeast, there is another dynasty that springs up. They are not from any noble lineage, they actually come from very humble backgrounds, but they also connect themselves in terms of lineage, of course, fabricating a genealogy, connecting them to the pre-Islamic heroes and kings of the Shahnameh. And there is an Arabic poem that was composed in honor of the Safarid leader Yaqub ibn al-Layth, who actually waged war against the Abbasid Caliph. And this is during that period when he's confronting the Abbasid Caliph. I'm going to read the matla, or the very first line of the poem in Arabic, just because of its sheer beauty. أنا ابن الأكرام من نسل الجم وهائز عرث ملوك العجم. I am born of the noble lineage of Jamshid. I am the inheritor of the kings of Persia. Here you have a very bombastic, strong claim to authority. He's saying, who are the Hashemites? I am descended of an imperial dynasty that goes back far, far greater in history. Then go tell the Hashemites, he's referring to the Abbasids, to step down before the hour is up, to return to your lands in Hijaz, in West Arabia, and to herd your goats and chew on lizards. He's making the case here that you come from a lowly Bedouin background. So what if you came from the same lineage as the Prophet? You don't actually have much to do with the Prophet. You come from the uncle's lineage. You come from a bunch of Bedouins. Whereas I come from the most powerful imperial dynasty, the universal sovereigns, and I am an inheritor to their legacy. And this kind of mirrors what is going on in the wider Ummah. As more and more pieces of the Ummah break off in terms of ideology, but also in terms of de facto authority from the Abbasid center in Baghdad, you have, of course, ideological discourses that justify and reflect this change. Here you see the only parts in dark green are really southern Mesopotamia and the rim of the Persian Gulf, and of course, the western Hijaz. The rest of this territory is now only nominally under Abbasid control. Sure, they send gifts and very humble tribute to the Caliph, but beyond that nominal submission that they give in order to receive that title from the Caliph, to really solidify their Islamic legitimacy, there isn't much in terms of connection between the periphery and the center anymore. Yet the Caliph, because of that, as a bestower of legitimacy, remains part and parcel of the political culture. And you see this in the Ghaznavid case quite clearly. So the Ghaznavids eventually make their way all the way to the east, and they reach the very fertile, very rich and populous lands of North India. You have it described in many of their chronicles as kind of an empire with a center, Ghazni, that is the imperial capital, with two wings. One wing's in Islamic Khorasan, the Islamic East, and another wing growing in India. In order to really sell this to the Khorasani Muslim emirs, and especially the Caliph in Baghdad, you find a discourse that is very much heavy with the notion of holy war, ghazwa, and jihad. We will see why this is more of a ruse than reflective of actual happenings on the ground. But nonetheless, it is a conquest, and a conquest that is violent. And it's not just a conquest, it's also a raid. This is the remnants of Somnath Temple, which Mahmud of Ghazna raids and destroys, and much is made of this in Islamic historiography, because he makes use of this as an ideological kind of program to underline for his Khorasani generals and the wider Muslim world, especially the Caliph, how he's taking the war to the infidels, how he is the sword of Islam and a loyal emir of the Abbasid Caliph. A lot of modern scholarship has naively just taken on that historiographic narrative of the Ghaznavids especially since it's kind of conducive to modern civilizational lines that are drawn. Think of the rise of Hindu nationalism in India. They make another use of this historiographic narrative, but from the other side, saying that, look, as soon as Islam entered India, there was nothing but raiding, pillaging, utter mayhem, and forced conversion. Nothing good came of the Islamic encroachment onto India. And of course, then you have the other extreme, with the Islamic jihadist groups using this as kind of an episode to draw inspiration from. The reality, however, is that that is not what Mahmud of Ghazna was doing in North India. What Mahmud of Ghazna was doing in India was building an empire. And when you conquer a people, you need to integrate the elites and the locality into your imperial structure. You need to speak to those elites in a way that they understand, in a way that is intelligible for them. On the left, you have a Ghaznavid coin that comes from India. On the left side of it, of course, the very first thing, even before the Shahada, the Islamic creed, you have the name of the Caliph, Al-Ghadir. La ilaha illallah, Muhammadan Rasulullah, and underneath you have Mahmud. So Mahmud, the pious Amir, expanding the borders of Islam and waging war on the infidels, a very great Muslim leader. Wonderful. On the other hand, you have a Sanskrit inscription, and you have a very different articulation of royal power. You have Mahmud described as Mprati, king in Sanskrit. So he's having to articulate his imperial legitimacy to two different constituencies simultaneously, and he's using very different language that is amenable and intelligible to those constituencies. For one, he's a pious Muslim, and it makes sense for them in that realm. And for the other, he's a king in the local fashion. He holds royal authority in the local fashion. And later on, he's using also various titles that the Emir, the Caliph, has given him as Emir. He is using a grander title called Yamin ad-Dawla. Yamin ad-Dawla being the preserver of the dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty. But one thing that you realize in the gold coin is that both sides, this is probably the coin that was circulated in the Islamic parts of his empire, obviously, both sides carry names of the Caliph as well as the Ghaznavid ruler. And this right being both mentioned, unlike the other coin, Al-Ghadir is put on an equal footing with the Ghaznavids. This is, I think, reflective of the growing power and assertiveness of the Ghaznavids. Sure, the Abbasid Caliph is still recognized, but nonetheless, is he necessarily greater, in that case, above me? No, not necessarily. And here you have the integration of more elements, local Indian, non-Muslim elements of political and imperial ideology. The elephant in Islamic discourse, and especially in the Quran, is usually viewed with suspicion. There is one chapter called Surat al-Fil, the chapter of the elephant, in which a dark sovereign wants to destroy the Kaaba, and he raises an army of elephants and marches on the Kaaba. But through God's divine will, he is attacked by an army of birds, and his army of elephants is destroyed before it even makes it to the Kaaba. So you have in the Islamic world this kind of darker image of the elephant. But of course in India, that is not the image. The image is a distinctly positive one. The image is of Airavata. And Indra rides on Airavata. And you want to associate yourself with the elephant in order to articulate to those local nobles that you wield legitimate royal and imperial power, a sacral one that makes sense to them in their religious cosmology and ideology. And you have the Ghaznavids doing precisely that, incorporating elephants, not just as, incorporating local military techniques and animals into their army, but also in terms of the political language that they're using. They're incorporating that into their discourse. And then you have the outright kind of subjugation of the caliphs by a small group of North Iranian brothers who put together an emirate of their own and managed to establish themselves in the Islamic heartlands. The light green is the Buyid Emirate at its very height. You can see that it includes Baghdad. Nonetheless, they remain loyal vassals of the caliph. In terms of political language, of course. For all intents and purposes, the caliph is their prisoner and under their rule. He's really a subject of these Buyid emirs. It doesn't change the fact that when you mint a coin, you still have to mention the name of the caliph and the title that he has bestowed upon you. You need the legitimacy that the caliph brings in order to rule in these lands. And you can see it reflected in the titles given to the Buyid emirs. Look at it. And all of these Dawla dynasty refers to the Abbasid dynasty, of course. So Buyid emirs take titles like Mu'izz ad-Dawla, exalter of the dynasty, Imad ad-Dawla, foundation of the dynasty, Rukn ad-Dawla, pillar of the dynasty. So their very sovereignty and authority is expressed in terms of what they are doing for the caliph, how they are upholding the rule of the caliph. And alongside this, you have the integration of the old Persianate notions of kingship. Again, it's not either or, it's the integration of both into a discourse that is Arabo-Persian. You have one of the most powerful rulers, if not the most powerful ruler of the Buyid Emirate, Panah Khosrow, the Sanctum of Khosrow. That is his Persianate title. But Adud ad-Dawla, pillar of the state, or pillar of the Abbasid dynasty, that is just as important. And you can see how each title is covering two different kind of discourses, political cultures at the same time. The coin that you see here mentions Shahanshah. On the left, bottom left, you can see the Islamic creed, of course. There is no God but the one God, and Muhammad is his messenger. And then you have the Arabic title, Al-Malik al-Muluk, King of Kings. And then the exact Persian, pre-Islamic, Sasanian equivalent, Shahanshah. And underneath that, you have the title bestowed upon the Buyid Emir by the Caliph, Adud ad-Dawla, pillar of the Abbasid dynasty. On top, you have two medallions. The silver one really is interesting because it doesn't even contain an Arabic inscription. It kind of revives the old Pahlavi, Middle Persian, pre-Islamic script and says, "May the Shahanshah be ever more glorious, and long live Shah Panah Khosrow." May the Shahanshah be ever more glorious. That is quintessentially Sasanian message and epigraph on coins. And they even eventually start to associate themselves with the geography and the imperial spaces of pre-Islamic Iran. They go to places like Takht Jamshid and Takht Rostam, and they make inscriptions in Arabic of their own. You can see on the left, that script is not Pahlavi. That script is not Middle Persian. That script is in Arabic. And it celebrates the visit of various Buyid emirs to that location and his discourse with various Zoroastrian priests who read for him, apparently, according to the inscription, the Pahlavi inscriptions of the Sasanians. So there's an engagement with the pre-Islamic Iranian past, but nonetheless, it's done and celebrated in the Arabic language. And so, rather than one or the other, what I'm trying to get across to you is that this is a fusion of two distinct political cultures into an integrated whole. I think we have to also consider the fact that this is an era of not just Persianate culture. This is a great era for Arabic literature, because the Buyids are great patrons of Arabic literature. Al-Mutanabbi, probably the greatest of medieval Arabic poets at least, is patronized by the Buyids, and he celebrates them in his Arabic poems. When he rose, they descended to prostrate themselves before his majesty, just as one would prostrate before the throne of Khosrow. And the next one really gives you an indication. It's not just imperial models, but it's also festivals, cultural events that are part and parcel of this change. He is Arab in tongue. His wisdom is the wisdom of philosophers, for he is sage, and his festivals are Persian festivals, such as Nowruz, the New Year, and Mehrigan. You see that in this culture, in order to be considered sophisticated, in order to have adab, in order to be part of that inner circle of elites, literati elites, political elites, you have to have a positive engagement and a deep engagement with the Persianate and Arabic traditions. It's not either or. And this brings me to what I hinted at the beginning, that it's the revival, or really, in large part, the creation, the reimagination of Iran and the Persianate world, but it's not the establishment of Iran as a political unit. There is, however, a distinct sense of Iranian identity that emerges in this period amongst some elites. And you can still kind of get a good sense of, there's a notion of a geography called Iran. Both of these works were, of course, written in Arabic before we ascribed any kind of nationalistic, ethno-linguistic kind of sentiment to them. The best cultivated, fairest, and most fertile part of the world, and the most established in its political life, is the realm of Iran Shah, even using the old Sasanian label for it. And you see how it kind of reflects the arrogant worldview which places Iran at the very center. Think of the story of the three brothers and the division of the world into the the Roman, Turanian, and Iranian worlds. And the other one also makes the case that in terms of culture, customs, the very nature of our being, we are superior and at the very center of civilization. I think we'll wrap it up there, and I will see you on Thursday. Goodbye.